It's titled very nicely, Economic Sharia, how Islam preaches small state, open markets, and strong society. So we are very ambitious and looking forward to listening to their views, and then we will have a discussion. Students and scholars will be participating, and I'm looking forward to this very interesting and very engaging discussion today. So I will request first Dr. Assad Zaman Sahib to, okay. So Assad Zaman Sahib prefers Ali Salman's Listen to Economic of Sharia. So I will invite Ali Salman to present his on Islamic economics and open markets.
Thank you. I will just speak from here. It's okay, because I don't have a formal presentation. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bahut shukriya Khalid. Thank you so much for very enlightening remarks, which has set the stage for discussion which we are looking forward to, along with Assad Zaman Sahib, for which we have benefited from research and articles for a long time. I think I'll put my initial remarks in maybe two sections. One is a general commentary on the Islamic economics as developed itself as a subject, and then what are my own views of what principles does Islam offer for economic organization of society. I am to begin with. Let me put a disclaimer. I am not using the term in Islamic economics in the normal sense as a subject as it has emerged. But I firmly believe that Islam has offered clear principles, both ethical as well as functional principles of public policy, which can help us in defining the economic conduct and in defining the public policy around it. If we go back to the history, let's say not too long ago, about let's say 100 years ago, when I think formally this relationship between Islamic and economics as two fields began to emerge, perhaps the first publication can be cited in this context is Allama Iqbal's Ilmul Iqtisad. This was published in 1904. This was presented as a textbook, and Allama Iqbal, for our international participants, he is the national poet of Pakistan, also considered national poet in Iran for his most of his work in Persian. Very influential philosopher who envisioned Pakistan as we see today. Iqbal was in his book. It's a textbook, so he has benefited a lot from then established economists. He is critical of both capitalism and socialism, but he has reserved sort of more harsher comments against capitalism, and he believes that capitalism is essentially an exploitative system which does not provide enough justice. But he is also critical of socialism in the sense that he says that it leads to the authoritarian rule of laborers or workers' unions is not good for economic progress. And later in his life, he argues that actually Islam does offer principles which we can refer to in terms of the economic organization But he did not use the word Islamic economics, which was a later terminology used. And then in the first half of the century, we of course see emergence of this part of the world, Maulana Maududi, from his discussions on Islamic economics, which started from of the banking interest. And Iran, we have Bakr Sadr. We heard from our speaker yesterday. And if you see the emergence of this thought process, critical of capitalism. And although later part of the later economists have used both Islamic socialism and Islamic capitalism as variants of this discussion, but I think Islamic economics is colored by a struggle imperialism. So it's also a sort of a reaction which we see in many of these authors. Identity which the Muslim philosophers were trying to establish in when the Muslim states were asserting independence from colonial time. So it is a post-colonial discussion, and so any discussion on the, I think Islamic economics can be looked at in that context. If we go back in the classical era, let's say teaching on economics, or Ibn Taymiyyah has written an extensive book on economics. If we look at the text of those classical scholars, we see a very different kind of narration. So it was referred yesterday when he was talking about taxation. He was not directly quoting. He was basing his arguments on empirical observations. The way he sees it, the way he portrays in terms of how low taxation is better, but you increase the taxation, it actually decreases the tax collection, and then ultimately it affects the very foundation of the state. And we know that Arthur Leffer, the Leffer curve is actually derived from Khaldun, which actually Arthur himself acknowledges. If you read, for instance, his classification of price systems is fascinating. The way he talks about a free price, fair price, is quite remarkable. It precedes modern day discussions of, let's say, how later Marshall or Adam Smith were to talk about price controls. They were using mathematics, they were not using graphs at that time, but the theoretical discussion I have mentioned in my earlier publications is quite fascinating. The harmful effects of price control mentioned by a Hanafi jurist Ibn Qudama, and he refers to what are the consequences of strict control in terms of how black market can emerge. So if you see, although these classical Muslim philosophers were not trying to create a new discipline, but their commentaries on the economic problems was really quite helpful in explaining the economic crisis of that time. But they were not, as such, in their discussion on economics, they were not driven by just their faith, driven by their own independent understanding of how, let's say, market behaving, what were. So, for instance, the discussion on debasement of currency in 14th and 15th century is fascinating by Muslim scholars, and they're mentioning the harmful effect of debasement and how this debasement is actually eroding the wealth of citizens, and then rulers, Muslim rulers, that this process of debasement is actually a theft. We heard Sheikh Umar, he said yesterday, inflation is a theft. Same sort of observation which they were relating. But if enter 20th century, as I highlighted, the discussion is very different. The discussion is to a sort of an assertion to establish an independent field of knowledge under this bigger movement of Islamization of knowledge. In my very humble opinion, this is not a religious obligation of us as practicing Muslims to assert as independent fields, because these fields of knowledge and discipline emerged from our understanding of the world itself, and therefore we understand, already the distinction as Muslims between ibadat and muamalat, and we do have, of course, the distinction of understanding in the itself, whereas we know that there is not much room in the matters of ibadat, right? So although at a metaphysical level, at conceptual level, we understand it's all can be translated as worship in a bigger sense, but let's say at a functional level, we do have these distinctions in our concept. So therefore, I do not think project of Islamic economics is a religious, and we should look at the questions provided under this subject with an open mind, and not attached with us. We do not have to buy into the whole Islamization of knowledge, because I think this will be problematic. This has been problematic. Now, having said that, as I said, the second part of my discussion is if we keep Islamic economics, do you have something to say on basis of Quran and Sunnah about economic of life, or it's just right? Christianity also has fundamental moral principles about economics. You cannot steal, for instance. So do we have similar messages, or do we have more messages? And there, I think my claim is, no, we have more functional messages, even public policies. And as Sahib was referring, comes unique of from his life. And from his life when he was, and the fact that in the pre-Islamic Arabia and Makkah, already a melt of religion, politics. It was a religion, but then it's also economic activity. Quraysh was also political leadership. And as a member of the tribe, but Muhammad had that leadership, and then with Nubuwwat, then he was able to present his own examples, a trader, as a merchant, as an economist, as a leader for Muslims for times to come. Therefore, we can actually look into those actual principles in Quran and also in his life. So I identify, for instance, 4 principles and 8 basic economic, 8 basic policies. Those principles are sanctity of right, private property, acknowledges, but it so also a limit on private property. So, for instance, how much there is no limit on how much land you can own. If you do not with the land for 3 to 5 years, then state has the right to take it. Then also we know that property ownership is absolute, but then claims, there are rights of both claimants and non-claimants into your property. It's not that you can have absolute ownership. There are limits to the ownership itself. Second big discussion in the history of literature is how is the land and natural resources. Who owns land and who owns natural resources? and it's a complex debate, and we see different examples by in itself. But the essential message is that the land and natural resources are a gift of Allah, and there should be under collective ownership. And that could be a community control, that could be a state control. State can award the use of resources to individuals, to private enterprises under fixed terms for certain terms and conditions, but then the ownership cannot be given to the private persons. So there is an incident in Sirah when the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave away a piece of land to a Sahabi, and later on discovered that there was a salt mine was discovered under the same piece of land. And when it was reported back to the Prophet, then he actually cancelled the lease, lease in the mountains. So, assuming that, okay, this is a natural resource and it should be like water and fire, they're all natural resources, and therefore it should be under of societal state control. And then the other two principles refer to the wealth creation and the distribution. And I think the ayah which was recited in the morning already commented once. I will not go into it, but it talks about voluntary exchange, it talks about trade, it talks about instead of wasting your wealth, you can grow your wealth by that by the voluntary exchange. So these are some of the principles which I think Islam offers in terms of economic organization of society. Now, again, these are principles. These are sort of very macro level principles. But what are the policy messages? So, I'm going to briefly mention 8 policy messages. First important policy message is of price control, price freedoms. So a lot of discussion always happens on price control. Prices do rise all the time. What Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, when he was approached with the complaint of rising of prices, what he did? More than once, when he was to intervene, the trader, he actually refused. He declined to intervene, and he said, the prices are set by Allah, and I am not going to be the one who is going to be held accountable for any injustice that may be done to some of you at the day of Qiyamah. So there is an extensive discussion in Islamic scholars. Again, there is no agreement. We see, for instance, the Hanafi school of thought and Shafi school of thought taken 2 different interpretations of the same hadith. So Hanafis have taken the view that for some public need, it is the state can intervene and introduce price controls. Some Shafi scholars have taken more like literalist views and said, well, the whole idea of price control that it can actually amount to injustice to some of the participants, and it is not allowed. But then, obviously, we always talk about, price freedom, but what about the deception? What about the cartelization? What about the deceit which happens in the market? What about the information exploitation? So all of these have been addressed in Sunnah itself. So we know about the institution of Hisbah, which was created as a sort of a market inspector, market regulator, and that institution has several functions to make sure that the contracts are enforced. The information is not exploited, but also, but price control, interestingly, is missing from the mandate of the regulator. So, so there was a practice, for instance, in that time that when a trade caravan is coming from outside Medina to inside Medina, people would go out to the city, intercept the caravan, and exchange some information. And Prophet Muhammad ﷺ actually stopped this practice. He said that, well, this is injustice to the incoming caravan because they are coming with a lot of effort, they have taken a lot of risk by importing the stuff, and if you pass information about demand in the city, then then this is not justice. And it's also not justice to for the consumers who are inside the city and who cannot, no mobile phones, who cannot actually communicate with the insider, with the trade caravan. So it will lead to what we today know as information asymmetry. So he stopped this practice and said, all the trade transactions have to be in the physical boundary of the marketplace. And there, the list can go on and on of ensuring economic justice, ensuring consumer protection, but no price control. The other important policy framework, when the first institution after the masjid was market, right? So which he established in Medina. There were 3 markets before that already existing in Medina, and it was a 4th market. And what was the most distinguishing feature of the marketplace itself? Prophet said there will be no taxes, there will be no tariffs in the marketplace. So it was a duty-free marketplace because he wanted to establish a clear comparative advantage in today's terms for the consumers, for the traders, and so that market ultimately thrived in its own right. So essentially, it's a free trade, unhindered trade in that sense, and actually we read about free flow of trade with enemy tribes all the time, except even during war, except for weapons. The free trade continued across, except there was an exception of weapons. We also hear, of course, then a major discussion is on riba and Islamic alternative. I have looked into literature, and it's a big discussion, and maybe a 2 days conference can be organized on this. But let me explain my position. There's a book which came out a few years ago by Muhammad Akram Khan, that is called "What is Wrong with Islamic Economics." And in that book, he has argued about riba and understanding of riba, not for the first time, but there are other scholars who have done the same. So my view is that, in that sense, only money can be classified as riba, and else is essentially trade financing, consumer financing, that needs to be treated differently. So if that can be accepted, then the modern banking itself have ridden themselves away with much of the exploitative function which was there in the private money lenders' time. So that is the position. For the social protection, there are 3 different policy responses. So obviously zakat is the first one, but I treat zakat as an obligatory tax and different rates. So scholars have identified rates from 2.5% to 20%, depending on what is the source of your income. And that is the only tax which is admissible. Yesterday we were talking about Salafi Muslims and Sufi Muslims, and our friend Mustafa mentioned that actually Salafi Muslims do not approve of taxes. They do not approve of taxes. It's a view which I am consistent. I'm also in favor that the zakat is the obligatory tax, and then there is no other tax except a land tax can be imposed. There we have because land is again something which it's a use which state is providing you. So apart of taxes, perhaps there should be no other taxes. The other social protection tool is, of course, waqf, which is essential. Well, very beautiful put by our colleague Fatiha yesterday. You said state, a welfare state, a state. I think I'm paraphrasing you correctly. So it's a state without a state. It is individual's wealth earmarked for social welfare, for charitable purposes. Strong belief in private property. We heard of our colleague from Bangladesh yesterday that he mentioned that in Islamic history, 1/3 to 3/4 land in the Islamic Empire are under the waqf. So it was, and that unfortunately nationalized by British, and then it was never given back to the owners. So this should be denationalized. Government has nothing to do with the waqf itself. Property is which Islam offered for social protection. It's a social protection of people by people itself. And lastly, there's one more point here: law of inheritance. Inheritance, and that is very explicit. Normally we hear principles, but in case of we see the actual distribution. Again, as a point of there cannot be any inheritance tax because in the list state is cannot here inherit unless there is a special circumstance when there is no one else to inherit, then can inherit. But under normal circumstances, state cannot impose what is called death tax on inheritance tax. Islamic, for instance, actually favored inheritance tax in his time. Yeah, I think these are some of the basic policy messages which I wanted to share from a principle, from conceptual level, practical level, concluding that this is not just an intellectual discussion. This is a very practical discussion, and we can learn from our own history without relating ourselves to any source of, let's say, whatever you call West knowledge or East knowledge. I, for one, do not distinguish between West and East. What is today's West they also inherited a lot in terms of knowledge from other sources of knowledge. So West is not West in that sense, and I do not have this us versus them approach. I think we need to learn the same way that they have learned at their time, and be more open in these in outlining these principles. So I think I should finish here, and maybe we can have more discussion.
Well, thank you very much for this economic Sharia, and the basic principles have been explained. I think it will be definitely raise many questions, and we will have some very serious discussion. But let me invite Dr. Asad Zaman Sahib